I want to look with you now at some habits for relational success. So when I trip over my husband's shoes at the back door, and I want to have a meltdown, which feels, by the way, delicious for about 30 seconds, I let it all rip. And then afterwards, I'm filled with remorse. This is not the person I want to be in my relationship. I've hurt the man I love. And then I have a cleanup operation while he is nursing his wounds for a few days. So when I'm in my best self, which is not always, but I try, I think for a moment about who I am, who I want to be in this relationship, who the man I love is, and what I want to be, how I want our relationship to work. Another key habit for relational success is mindfulness, as I mentioned earlier. Richard Davidson and Jon Kabat-Zinn have brought Buddhist practices of mindfulness into a more secular context. One of the most exciting research endeavors and conversation endeavors in neuroscience now is going on, believe it or not, between the Dalai Lama and neuroscientists about compassion, about empathy, even about drug addiction, about change in neuroplasticity. So trying to understand the dynamics of mindfulness has been really helpful for the neuroscientists, and I think it's a really important practice for couples. I try to help couples nurture the we instead of that me versus you, and facilitate respect and equality in their relationship. I try to help them take co-responsibility for the relationship. Nurturing positivity is a key aspect of relational success. It's not just how can we help couples not be so negative in conflict. It's how can we help them nurture the positive emotions. How can we nurture gratitude? How can we nurture generosity? Neuroscientists have found that when people are generous, the reward centers of their brain light up even more than when they receive generous acts from other people. It feels good to do good. I work with couples on constructive conflict, on not getting overwhelmed and dysregulated in conflict. I work a lot on repair. One of the dumbest lines from a movie that I've ever heard is, love means never having to say you're sorry. In fact, love means having to say you're sorry a lot. I work with couples on empathy, compassion, and care. One of the least understood aspects of love is what I call the protective urge. We want to take care of our partner. We're not just looking out for ourselves. And many neuroscientists now are studying the dynamics and the neurobiology of compassion and care. As Dr. Keltner, a neuroscientist in California, says, we're born to be good. Other neuroscientists talk about the tend and befriend instinct. This is Shelley Taylor's work. That we're as wired to seek others and care for others as we are to defend ourselves through fight or flight. It's very important in couple relationships to nurture physical passion and gentle touch. We want to help couples let the oxytocin flow. Many couples live as roommates, never touching each other, never having sex, and they're missing the magic, the elixir of oxytocin. Remember, oxytocin lowers cortisol, the stress hormone. I think that overall what I'm trying to help couples in therapy do is learn how to engage in proactive loving rather than passive loving, where they both take responsibility for being the best they can be in the relationship. This involves nurturing neuroplasticity and nurturing relationship plasticity, where both partners are working to be their best selves in the relationship. I want to talk with you now about what I call neuroeducation. Neuroeducation is when I help clients become aware of what's going on in their brain when they're emotionally reactive, when they're having a meltdown, and what's going on when they are able to calm themselves down. For example, we talk about the limbic tango, or what I call with a little poetic license, the dance of amygdalas. This is actually de-shaming. In other words, a client can say, my amygdala made me do it when I had a meltdown. It's also empowering because the client can say, my prefrontal cortex allows me to make better choices. So knowing about the brain is both de-shaming and empowering for clients in therapy. I help couples learn to pause before responding. This is what Daniel Siegel calls the pause that refreshes. And in this process, clients can bring prefrontal thoughtfulness to emotional reactivity. And we know that when the prefrontal cortex becomes active, when we name our emotions, when we regulate our emotions, the prefrontal cortex gets more active and the amygdala calms down. This, by the way, is not true with depressed clients or violent clients whose amygdalas may be overactive or prefrontal cortex unable to calm down the amygdala. I help couples identify their goals and values. That's a higher brain function. And then we operationalize those goals and values into specific habits or changes they want to make in their relationship. So some couples, for example, will write a 10 commandments of our relationship. And when couples do that, it's very interesting. Both partners tend to come up with very similar lists. And then they own the lists. The change comes from within them rather than my trying to impose change upon them. I want to look at some specific techniques for emotion regulation that are informed by neurobiology. When people have temper tantrums, often they say to me, I have no idea where that came from. All of a sudden I'm at 100 screaming and yelling. What I help such clients do is tune into the prodromal cues, the cues from their bodies, the clenched teeth, the rapid heart rate, the throbbing in their head that precedes the actual meltdown, so they can back up and identify when they're starting to go into emotional overdrive and then calm down sooner in the cycle. I also normalize the anger, de-shaming it, and then discuss ways that they can calm down their own tempers. I want to share with you a specific imagery technique that I devised. I help a client who's feeling all agitated. I suggest to her, let's imagine, see if you can picture your amygdala, all agitated, all aroused. This is with the eyes closed, in that centered kind of exercise pose. Imagine your amygdala all aroused and agitated. And then imagine your prefrontal cortex coming in like a good parent to calm down the amygdala. And my clients love this exercise. It's very empowering. They actually get the hang of imaging the prefrontal cortex calming down the amygdala. And in this case, the brain then will imitate what's going on in the exercise. And in fact, the prefrontal cortex does calm down and does help them regulate their amygdala. I define emotion regulation as empowerment. I define a meltdown as disempowerment. Remembering what my father taught me about Seneca, most powerful is the person who has himself in his own power. I want to talk with you now a little bit about empathy. One of the first things I did in preparing to research for this book is I Googled the neuroscience of empathy on my computer, and I came up with a wealth of information. And I want to share with you some of the perspectives that I learned. One is that empathy is actually a multi-layered process composed of several different aspects. The first is resonance. This is a subcortical automatic process where we feel what the other person feels in our own body. One of the mechanisms for this is mirror neurons, where we feel in our body exactly the same thing that the other person is feeling. That's automatic. It's a way of just being in tune with the other person. That's the first level of empathy. The next level of empathy is cognitive empathy. It's a prefrontal cortex process. And cognitive empathy is where we intentionally put ourselves in the other person's shoes. I wonder what they're thinking or feeling. And by the way, people differ on how accurately they understand another person's process. So empathic accuracy differs among different people, and it can be increased. The third component to empathy is boundaries between the self and the other. I need to know where I end and you begin if I'm going to truly feel your pain and not mix you up with me. And the final component is self-regulation. So if I'm a therapist and my client is telling me a sad story and I start sobbing, clearly that's not going to be helpful to my client. It's going to be about me, not the client. But if my client is telling me a sad story and I tear up and I feel very empathically attuned, and it's really about the client and my resonating with them, that is helpful. So my ability to regulate my own emotions is the final component of empathy. Now I want to talk with you a little bit about empathy. It's not quite so simple as it sounds. It turns out that neuroscientists have found we have empathy for people in our in-group. They've looked at people of the same race, for example, or different races. We tend to feel an empathy bias towards our in-group people, our own race, for example, people like us. We tend to feel less empathy for the out-group, the person of another race or another group, another clan. This is rather sobering, actually. And oxytocin, if you give people oxytocin, one of the things people do now to study oxytocin is they spritz oxytocin up the nose. It's called intranasal oxytocin. And that bypasses the blood-brain barrier, and it allows the oxytocin to go right into the brain. It doesn't last for more than a few minutes. What happens when you spritz oxytocin into the brain, into the nose, and therefore to the brain, is that people become nicer, more trusting, more trustworthy, more empathically accurate, more generous. But this is only true for the in-group. It's not true for the out-group. Now, I want to ask you to consider what it means in a couple. When we start out falling in love, there's a boundary around us. We are the in-group. But in a couple like Eric and Lisa, over time, as they become strangers or enemies to each other, they become kind of an out-group each to each other. And so it's very likely that the empathy circuits are dampened when we feel so antagonistic towards each other. Furthermore, there's some gender differences with regard to empathy. I want to just share them with you now. Overall, women tend to use their resonance circuits more than men do, and their amygdala and other resonance circuits are activated during empathy. Men are more cognitive in their empathy, and they differentiate self from other during empathy, which I find very interesting. Probably some of this has to do with hormones, some of it has to do with how the brain is wired. On top of our natural tendencies that are gender different, how boys and girls are socialized makes a huge difference. So boys are socialized not to tune into feelings, not to tune into empathy. They're socialized to compete and to prevail. Girls, meanwhile, are trained in all kinds of empathy talk with their girlfriends. They're playing with their dolls. They're talking to their moms about their relationships. So the girls are being trained as empathy experts. The boys are often, not always, but often de-skilled in social intelligence and in particularly empathy expertise. When you bring these two people together in a heterosexual relationship, it often causes havoc. She's looking for the emotion, oxytocin-drenched connection she had through empathy with her girlfriends, as Lisa had with Kathy. He is feeling perhaps overwhelmed with her pressure to come forward and be more empathic because he hasn't had the training. So this creates havoc. How we raise our sons and daughters actually creates havoc, I believe, in relationships when they become adults. I teach empathy skills to clients in therapy. So Eric is so out of touch with his body, with his own emotions, and certainly with Lisa's emotions. I start by teaching him to tune into his own body and to get the body cues that signal what's going on in his body and therefore what's going on also in Lisa's body, what's going on in her emotional life. Eric is extremely wooden when he tries this out. He's going through his left brain, he's all cognitive, he's thinking, what would I feel like if I were Lisa right now? Lisa watches this wooden, awkward attempt on Eric's part, and she rolls her eyes, which, by the way, as Gottman has showed us, is a sign of contempt. So she's rolling her eyes in contempt, and I try to calm her down, and I say, Lisa, I know this for you looks pretty awkward, but Eric's trying to get the hang of empathy, so hang in there with him, because eventually, if he practices it enough, it will become natural. And sure enough, with practice, Eric becomes more adept at empathy, and it becomes more of the emotional resonance and not just the wooden cognitive empathy. Now, Lisa is much better at resonance than Eric is. She got the hang of empathy when she was a little girl. However, her cognitive empathy is blocked because she sees Eric through the lenses of contempt. So I help her do a cognitive reappraisal where she sees her husband as working hard to try to be a better husband, working hard to learn empathy, so that she can calm down her contempt and get her compassionate circuits working better. One more thing I want to say about gender and empathy. Research has found that when men watch another person in pain, their pain circuits light up in empathy. That's something that happens to women too. But unlike women, for men, if the person they're watching in pain was shown to be unfair in a prior interaction, the men's empathy circuits are dampened for the other in pain. So when men sense that someone is unfair, their empathy dampens. Now, why is this relevant to couples? Many men in heterosexual relationships feel unfairly criticized by their partner, their female partner. And I'm wondering if that perhaps dampens some of their empathy circuits and inhibits the processes of empathy between the couple.